Right now I want you to meet the two people who are going to provide the presentation here for you today. The first is Jessica Mackey. She's the good-looking one.
It's not true.
She says that's not true.
You're going to break me down, Jim.
I know. Sooner or later. See, we're getting used to one another now. Yeah. Jessica, by the way, has over 14 years of experience in the environmental sector, including extensive experience in water quality, focusing on baseline characterization and predictive mass balance modeling in support of environmental assessments. As well, flip it over. Right next to her is Trevor Crozier, and Trevor is a principal hydrogeological engineer. He specializes in contaminant hydrogeology, numerical groundwater flow, and contaminant transport modeling, and the assessment and remediation of contaminated sites. I should tell you that both of these people, this is not their first rodeo. They have provided assessments and have been working in this field in countries literally all around the world. So would you please welcome Jessica and Trevor.
Thanks, Jim. We'll be talking, as Jim has said, about surface water quantity and quality. I'll be talking about the quantity pieces. Jessica's going to talk about the quality. So we do hand it off back and forth, and we do jump from quantity to quality back and forth throughout. So if we get lost or we lose you on the way, I'm talking quantity and Jessica's talking quality for the most part. Quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We'll be delving into an overview of the hydrologic cycle. So where does the water come from? Where does it go? What are we concerned with? We'll be talking about the methods that we use for data collection, the methods that we went into to do our assessment. We'll recap our baseline results, so what are the current conditions at the site right now, and then we'll get into the effect assessment results. So quickly, the hydrologic system that we're concerned with is divided into two valued components, four I guess, surface water quantity and quality. Surface water being anything that is found on the surface of the earth or runs off in creeks, streams, or is present in lakes. And groundwater, which is water beneath the land surface in the saturated zone. So not really considering that zone that's dry between the top of the ground and where you first encounter water. That would be unsaturated. Where does the water in the system come from? Well, it comes from rainfall and snowmelt. What we see is rainfall falls on the land surface where it can either run off to streams, creeks, and lakes, or it infiltrates. If it falls as snow, it might build up as snowpack and then melt in the spring, and then either infiltrate or run off, depending on the land types that it's on. Once it reaches the water table, that water will also flow under a hydraulic gradient towards rivers, creeks, lakes, surface water bodies. So that's how we've divided things up. In terms of our valued components, this is a map of the overall effects assessment that was put together for the project. We'll be talking about this box here, groundwater quantity and quality, and surface water quantity and quality, and the changes the project might affect on those valued components. We do, however, pass the results of our assessment on to other disciplines for use in their assessments. So we've passed results on to fish and fish habitat, wildlife, vegetation and terrestrial ecosystems. We've also passed it on to the social aspect of things, so what's going on in Jackal Lake, and health aspects, so country foods, potable water, that type of thing. Talk a little bit about our study areas, the areas that we considered and collected data from for the purposes of understanding baseline. The regional study area for surface water is the Peterson Creek catchment area, that's outlined in purple here. It starts down here in the south at Chewells Mountain, runs northeast, east, and then north through Kamloops and joins the South Thompson River there. This red outline is about the central third of that Peterson Creek catchment area. That's where the project is located, so there's the tailings storage facility here, the open pit, South Mine Rock Storage Facility, East Mine Rock Storage Facility. To help you get located, there's Jackal Lake there. And this blue line represents the pipeline alignment from Kamloops Lake that will supply water up to the project site. Study area for groundwater, a little bit larger. It's outlined, the regional area that we looked at for collecting data is outlined in yellow. It encompasses Cherry Creek here, Peterson Creek, and off the backside, Anderson Creek. Kamloops Lake is here, South Thompson River is there. The more localized study area, the local study area is outlined in black dash. That's the area where we're anticipating effects might occur, so changes to groundwater quantity or quality might be anticipated inside that area. That's where we've focused our data collection and our study. Some other things I'd like you to be aware of that are shown on this map. In pink, there's lots of pink, are the mapped bedrock aquifers. Those aquifers are mapped by the province and available on the BC Water Resources Atlas. You can find out where they are. In gray, a little harder to see, are the shallow sand and gravel aquifers in the area. The two most important to our study are Peterson Creek Aquifer here and the Davidson Brook Aquifer there. That's Knutsford right in that area. Red dots, there's other colors there, but they don't turn up too well. Those are registered wells in the study area. They're registered with the province, so wherever it's been registered and there's a well log, we've been able to have a look at that to understand what depth to water is and what those wells are completed in. Let me see, the last line of interest is this pink one, which outlines the water supply limits from the city. So people inside this line get their water, for the most part, from the city water supply system. People outside are probably relying on well water. Or they're bringing water in from other areas, like Canada Springs or something like that. So how did we do our assessment? This is an overview of our methodology up in the top left box. Baseline conditions. That's our understanding of the climate. So how much rain, how hot does it get, when is it cold? Surface water quantity and quality, what are the baseline conditions? And groundwater quantity and quality. Where is water found? What is the quality of that water in the study area? Once we have an understanding of those baseline conditions, we use that to come up with some models to understand how those valued components might be affected by the project. So how might surface water flows change? How might groundwater flows change? What might the changes to water quality be as a result of the project? The models we develop include a surface water model, a groundwater model. Together, those inform what we call the water balance. So how much water gets input to a system, how much comes out, how does it balance, how will the project change that? That's where the quantity effects assessment comes from. So about this point here is where I'm done. We then tie the source terms, that a geochemical source term. What that is an explanation of the chemical signature that water will pick up when it falls on things like tailings or waste rock or undisturbed ground. So we look at those source terms, we marry them up with the surface water water balance, and together they allow us to come up with water quality predictions. So this is where the bulk of Jessica's work was undertaken. Altogether, the results of this modeling allow us to do our effects assessment, which we'll be talking about later today. Before we get into baseline, a couple of things people should be aware of about the project study area. It was mined previously, so Teck operated a mine from there from the late 1980s, till the late 1990s. Left over from that effort are 2 reclaimed mine rock piles and 3 open pits. One of them's backfilled, and the other 2 are slowly filling with surface water runoff and groundwater. There's a Trans-Mountain pipeline that transects the property, and Jackal Lake. Jackal Lake's been modified as far back as the late 1800s, early 1900s for water supply and irrigation. So the area's been previously disturbed, and there is existing water management on the site right now. Surface water monitoring. Well, what we did there was to understand how the flows occur as we go out and we measure them in the streams. So we'll install stations like we've done here, one called Jack Inf on Peterson Creek Upper, just above the inflow to Jackal Lake. There's one on Keens Creek, which is outlined in this green dashed area, that measures runoff from there before it joins Peterson Creek just below the lake. There's 2 stations on the lake, Jack Lake and Jack Seep. Jack Lake measures the amount of water that passes over the spillway currently under natural runoff conditions. Once that water drops below the level of that dam, the water bailiff comes out and will release water from the low-level outlet. That's monitored by this other station called Jack Seep. Further downstream of that, we have the Peter Station, which is located just below the downstream extent of the footprint, so of the mine. And over here, PC 0.2 or 02.0.
2.1.
2.1. It's the station where we resolve all of the surface water and surface water quality, groundwater quality points. So that station is going to come back and be talked about throughout this presentation. It's located just below the confluence of Peterson Creek with Davidson Brook at Knutsford. The right here is a graphic showing what we've learned from that monitoring. This shows us the surface water flows that run off at Jack Imp Station. What we see is most of that runoff occurs between March and September. About 85% of that runoff is concentrated in 3 months from April, May, and June, largely in response to snowmelt further up in the system. Just a review of the existing water management that happens at Jackal Lake. We know that Jackal Lake stores currently about 4.2 million cubic meters of water. About 1 million cubic meters of that water is allocated for water licenses on Jackal Lake, for storage, for conservation, for irrigation. The graphic at right shows how water was managed at that lake in 2014. The bottom here is the calendar months. This is May. You can see that after things start to melt, the lake starts to flow over the spillway, and that's done in this red line about the middle of July. So that's when the water level's below the crest of the dam. You can see these two green spikes. They're about 3 weeks long, separated by a period of about 3 weeks. That's when the water bailiff showed up and let water out from that low-level outlet for the downstream water licenses. Groundwater quantity monitoring. So to understand where groundwater is present at site and the direction that it's moving in, we measure the level of water. We also measure how quickly it can pass through those materials, whether it's sand and gravel or rock. We've done that at these locations shown in yellow. There are 115 locations installed around the project. Shown in yellow, we've tried to get them upstream and downstream of the major project facilities and to give ourselves broad spatial coverage of the area that might be affected. We've also been given data for 42 wells up in the Aberdeen area from the city. They're historic wells that were installed as part of the new Afton mine development over in this area. And 242 well logs within the larger study area are available to us as well from the Water Resources Atlas, though not shown on this graphic. Review of the data from those installations explains or allows us to explain how groundwater moves at the site. We know that it is recharged in the uplands from rainfall and snowmelt. It flows north towards Kamloops Lake and the South Thompson River. The project area is shown here in red. You'll notice there's an oval-shaped area here. That coincides with a local upland. What this does is it prevents water from flowing through here. So it's called a groundwater divide. And it forces the water to flow east, starting at about Jackal Lake into Peterson Creek, or west into Cherry Creek.
All right, water quality. So we have a very large database of water quality for the project. We have been sampling water, surface and groundwater, since 2007. We have 38 water quality sampling locations. 33 of them are actively sampled currently. And then from a groundwater perspective, we have 46 monitoring wells at 31 locations. And at several locations, we're monitoring shallow, intermediate, and deep groundwater to see if there is a difference with depth. Furthermore, we have managed to sample several of the residential groundwater wells in and around the property, and they give us an understanding of what water quality looks like just a little bit further away from where we have permission to drill. All of these samples we're analyzing for general chemistry, nutrients, major anions, metals, and organic carbon, and these are the same parameters that we're carrying through in all of our modeling. So these are the locations, they're pretty busy, of where we're sampling. The bottom left-hand corner is the groundwater monitoring wells, groundwater quality monitoring wells. There are a few less sites where we're monitoring water quality compared to where they're monitoring water quantity. But as you can see, we have them up gradient and down gradient of all the proposed facilities. And we have some located outside of the area expected to be affected, so we understand what it is in reference areas. For surface water, The majority of our sites for water quality are located within a Peterson Creek catchment, and then some are located further to the west in the Cherry Creek catchment, and then south in Anderson Creek. The Cherry Creek and Anderson Creek provide us with reference conditions. This site right here is one that I'll pay more attention to later. It's PCO2, and it is the extent to where we model our water quality to. So our baseline understanding to date, this is a very condensed version of what's in the EA. With surface water, we see strong seasonal variability in that water. What we see, it coincides quite well with what we see in the surface water flows. When flows are really low, we see higher concentrations, and that is due to the greater influence of groundwater, where the concentrations of most parameters are higher. Groundwater, spatially, we see lower concentrations in the upland areas, closer to the recharge zones, and then we see higher concentrations lower along the valley in Peterson Creek, and then in the proposed open pit area. Our baseline assessment, we found several parameters that naturally exceed water quality guidelines, the generic guidelines. So those were sulfate, chloride, copper, molybdenum, and selenium. We're in the process of developing water quality benchmarks for these, and what water quality benchmarks take into consideration are the site-specific conditions. So you have different hardness or different temperature, different species present that make the generic water quality guidelines for the province less applicable. So you look very specifically at the site conditions, and those are in the process of being developed with cooperation with MOE. We did a research of the groundwater quality in the regional area, in the Kamloops area, and through government literature, we found that dissolved solid, sulfate, arsenic, and nitrate have been identified at levels that exceed drinking water guidelines in the greater Kamloops area and groundwater.
So that's what we know about baseline. A little bit more on some of the modeling that we did as part of this work. Surface water modeling, we developed the model in Excel, so it's a spreadsheet-based model. People can look at the calculations that have been done there and see how we've done everything. The intent is that it's transparent. Inputs to the model are precipitation, temperature, and evaporation. Those are tied to a watershed area, so once we've got the area and the rainfall rate, we can understand what the runoff rate will be. The land type in that watershed area is important. Different types of land surfaces have different runoff and different infiltration rates, so that's been considered as part of this model. That will give us a first estimate of what is running off in the streams and creeks, what's building up in lakes. Then we have to consider what the groundwater contribution to that system is. So in areas where groundwater is discharging into the creek, there's an additional contribution of water that we have to be aware of. If the stream bed is higher than the groundwater table, then maybe that stream is losing water down into the groundwater system. So that's looked at, and we're representing that by this two-way arrow. There's an input or an output. Together, those develop our stream flow water quantity estimate. So that's the model, that's how we came up with it. How good is it? Well, you have to calibrate it to your observations. So earlier I talked about these blue lines representing the runoff that we're seeing at the Jack Inf station just above Jacko Lake. In gray is the model predictions for the baseline conditions. And what we can see is we match those runoff values fairly well. We've got a good calibration. In terms of groundwater modeling, we developed a three-dimensional groundwater flow model in ModFlow. ModFlow is a program developed by the United States Geological Survey. It's been benchmarked and tested and frequently used in these types of studies. We calibrated that model to the water levels that we measured in the wells. We also calibrated it to stream flows measured in Peterson Creek. We did some pumping tests in between Jacko Lake and the proposed pit. We did another one down in the Peterson Creek aquifer to give ourselves a bigger understanding of what the hydraulic conductivity of the rock is and how it responds when you pump it, remove water from it, how quickly it recovers. We calibrated to that information as well. We used the same climate inputs as were used in the surface water balance model, so the same preset, the same evaporation are used. And what we used this model for, once we'd calibrated it to baseline conditions, which is shown here, you can see that it's a fairly good representation of the interpreted groundwater flow that I had up earlier. There's the the groundwater divide, there's Jackal Lake, and we can see that flow is moving this way towards Peterson Creek and this way into Cherry Creek. What we do is we say, okay, let's excavate a big hole in the ground surface here. What does that do to the direction of groundwater flow? How does it change? We also looked at if we put tailings here or waste rock here and here, how does that change the way groundwater flows? And where might seepage that's come into contact with these facilities end up? So how does that seepage-affected groundwater flow occur at the site as a result of the project? Finally, we did some groundwater quality modeling. Specific to this area here in the yellow box, you can just see the outline of the Peterson Creek aquifer here, and of interest is this red dot. That's a well, the nearest residential water well to the project downstream of it. We've identified it as Res 2 in our study, and what we used our model for was to look at whether or not seepage-affected water from the mine could reach it. And what we learned was seepage from the East Mine Rock Storage Facility, the water management pond that we'll install downstream of that facility, and this Peterson Creek diversion pond could reach Res 2. We developed predictions of what the changes in those water qualities might be as a result of that. Jessica will talk about that a little later on.
So we also created a surface water quality model to develop an understanding of what water quality looks like both within the mine facilities and at sites further downstream in Peterson Creek and in Jackal Lake. So we developed this model initially with a baseline hydrological model, and we then calibrated with our baseline water quality. And then we used the outputs of that model to inform how the baseline surface water and groundwater would contribute into our life of mine effects assessment model. So we took the life of mine water balance model, which also includes the groundwater inputs, and then we attached that to the source terms that were provided by Lorax for all of the contact water. And then we also included the dustfall results from that Stantec provided to us in the water quality model as well. So all these models come together with a whole bunch of different assumptions into the development of them, and it's really important to understand how, because this model is at the tail end of so many models, how the different assumptions can affect water quality. So we do these sensitivity scenarios. We did in total 13. We ran the water quality model through climate history. So we looked at the variability in climate and the effects that would have on water quality. We looked at the performance of the mine rock storage facility covers to see if they were less effective, what effect that would have on water quality. We looked at numerous groundwater input assumptions, and we looked at the range of baseline data. So we ran the model with very high concentrations from our baseline data set to see how that would also affect our water quality, as well as very low, so we could get a range of expected or potential concentrations. And then we also looked at the dustfall and how, if we assumed more dustfall or less dustfall in the model, or the solubilities and whatnot, and then also considered seepage delays, because the time it takes for seepage to arrive in a creek can change when the concentrations peak in the creek.
So specific studies that we looked at as part of the effects assessment included a detailed look at surface water and groundwater flow into and out of Jackal Lake. We considered the collection and use of surface water in the mine footprint. We looked at collection and use of groundwater that might enter the pit during operations. Extraction of water from Kamloops Lake, what's the effect of that withdrawal on Kamloops Lake? Development of a pit lake enclosure, would one form or not? Well, it does. It's predicted to form. The magnitude and flow direction of seepage, so where's that contact water potentially ending up, and potential impacts to the Aberdeen subdivision. In terms of potential effects to groundwater quantity, I'll walk you through this busy diagram. What this shows is the change in groundwater level predicted as a result of the project. So here's Jackal Lake, there's the open pit, the East Mine Rock Storage Facility, Aberdeen's up here, Tailing Storage Facility is here, South Mine Rock Storage Facility is there. This is the edge of our local study area where we're thinking effects would occur. The yellow shows us where the water level has been lowered as a result of the project. So mining the pit has an effect on the groundwater level. That water will flow preferentially towards this pit. Where we've built the tailing storage facility, what we see is a rise in groundwater level. That's because as part of the mining process, the rock is ground up, that residual sand and silt size stuff from the mill is mixed with water and piped and deposited out here behind the tailing storage dam. So that water infiltrates into the subsurface and results in this rise in groundwater level. This area is about a 2-kilometer radius around the center of the project. Of interest to people living in Aberdeen is there's no effect predicted in Aberdeen. We're not seeing a change in groundwater level as a result of the project for our best estimate scenario or for any of our sensitivity scenarios. Outside of this area, patterns of recharge and discharge are generally going to remain as they are currently. Jackal Lake seepage, we see a little bit more seepage from the lake into the pit. Groundwater discharge to Peterson Creek lower, so downstream of the lake, is going to be reduced by about 9% on average through the year. The pit lake I was talking about earlier will form. It's going to stabilize at an elevation of about 760 meters after about a period of 300 years. That level is about 120 meters below the existing surface there, so it's not going to spill. What do I mean by stabilize? Well, that means that the rate of water flowing into the pit comes to an equilibrium with the rate that it's being evaporated off the surface of that lake. So that's how it will stabilize. What have we learned about surface water quantity? Well, in terms of residual effects, I'll tell you about what we learned in the project area and also at Kamloops Lake. First, a little bit on what is a residual effect. Our study encompasses all of the mitigations that were built into the project over the design period. So if we've got a cover on the mine rock or the tailing storage facility at closure, we've looked at the effect of that. If we're intercepting water with ponds, we've considered that. What do we learn? Well, in Jackal Lake, we know the average annual flow rate is about 160 cubic meters per hour into the lake. The 2.5-year construction period will affect that flow rate. It's going to cause it to drop about 3 cubic meters per hour, which is a reduction of about 2%. By the end of operations, year 23, and through the decommissioning and closure period, that will drop further to about 151 cubic meters per hour, which is a decline of 6%. Into post-closure, once we've built that and reclaimed that closure landscape, it gets a little bit better. It recovers to about a 5% reduction. At the other side of the project, PCO2 station, we see existing conditions are an annual average of about 247 cubic meters per hour. At the end of construction, we'll see that decline by about 12%. That's going to get worse to about 17% by the end of operations. But once that pit lake is formed and things have stabilized, you'll see it gets better, recovers to about a 6% reduction. In terms of Kamloops Lake, busy table, I'll step you through it. We've got the months of the year left here. These two columns show the flow measured at Savinaw Station in meters cubed per second and meters cubed per hour. This is the column that's important here. And what we did to look at the effect of the project was to look at what the maximum withdrawal rate from the Ajax project would be. The Ajax project will be applying for a 1,505 cubic meter per hour license. The residual effect that we've considered is we've also looked at what New Afton is going to be taking or applying to take at that same location. So the combined total is 1,805 cubic meters per hour. That translates into, by month, less than 0.3% effect on the flow at Savinaw for average annual flow. We also did a comparison to 10-year low flows, and that 0.28% gets up to about 0.39%, so less than 1% effect on the Kamloops Lake flows. I told you a little bit about the seepage pathway modeling that we've done for the study. This is one graphic that we looked at showing where seepage from the tailing storage facility is predicted to end up. These purple lines represents the pathways taken by particles released in our model to see where they would end up over time. We released a particle from every block of the model cells in there, so you see this big purple pathway. What that shows us in plan view is that most of this seepage is predicted to end up in the pit. So because we're lowering the water level, it's drawing groundwater over to it, and that's where most of this seepage will end up. We do see some shallow pathways represented here, where things daylight at the toes of the dams, where they will either evaporate because the rate of flow and seepage is going to be lower than what the evaporation rate will be, or if there's enough of it or it's coming out fast enough, it'll be ditched and collected into a water management pond constructed downstream of the tailings area at various locations. There's also similar ponds over here for the dumps. We've got these graphics for each of the facilities and some of the ponds, but don't have time to talk about all of them.
So the water quality effects assessment, the basis of the effects assessment was the existing water quality guidelines in BC. If a parameter exceeded one of those guidelines, it was carried through into the effects assessment. If it didn't, then it wasn't. So in our modeling, we actually found that in Jacko Lake and the Peterson Creek downstream pond that there were no parameters predicted to exceed guidelines at those locations. So we didn't have any parameters to carry through in the effects assessment, which was good. Humphrey Creek, which is just off to the side here, we carried through sulfate, copper, molybdenum, and selenium into our effects assessment for that due to the incremental increase in the concentrations of those parameters in that creek. And then in Peterson Creek, PCO 2.3, which is just downstream of the Peterson Creek downstream pond, we carried through sulfate only at that location. Further downstream at PCO 2, we carried through a few more parameters at that site, but the importance of this site is that it is the furthest site downstream where we have accounted for all lost seepage from the mine facilities on site. So anything that is going to come to surface water is accounted for at this modeling location. So at this site, we saw changes in sulfate, chloride, and selenium concentrations. And as I stated earlier, water quality benchmarks were developed for every one of these parameters because they're already elevated under baseline conditions. So I think chloride is worth mentioning at this point because we don't see much loading coming from the mine in that site. This parameter is, we believe it's elevated at this location due to the extensive road salting that's occurred along that area, because we also see it elevated in residential wells along that area. So the groundwater quality assessment, the actual residual effects of this assessment were carried through into the human health VC, but in order to meet the requirements of the EA, we carried this through in a similar manner as we carried it through for surface water. And so the parameters that got carried through in our assessment were fluoride, sulfate, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. And it's because we saw a slight increase in these concentrations in the Res 2 monitoring well. One of the important notes on that was that no new parameters were predicted to exceed health-based guidelines. Some of these parameters already do exceed health-based guidelines, but no new parameters were actually raised as a result of the changes predicted in the modeling. What we understand from this and all of the modeling that BGC did is that the potential effects to groundwater quality are quite localized to the project area. And as previously stated, we're accounting for all of them in our surface water quality node at PCO2.
So I've talked a little bit about some of the mitigations that we considered in our modeling work. This is a quick high-level summary of where those mitigations are explained. The water management plan, the erosion and sediment control plan. This acronym stands for metal leaching and acid rock drainage management plan. The air quality monitoring and dust fall or dust control plan were also factored in. More specifically, what that means is water management and erosion prevention and sediment control measures will be implemented before construction, and that'll be maintained during operations. Construction will build water management ponds downstream of those facilities to intercept contact runoff before it can get into creeks or Jacko Lake. Seepage management by design and optimization of the placement of those water management ponds will occur. We'll try to maximize water reuse on site to reduce the needs from Kamloops Lake. Mine rock characterization will help us understand the types of rock coming out of the open pit and where they will end up. So it might be better to place one type of rock in the East Mine Rock Storage Facility and another one in the south or west at the toe of the at the toe of the Tailing Storage Facility. Dust management is a whole other area that I know little about, but those have been factored into the dust fall contributions to the water quality model. You can learn more about that at probably the air quality presentation. And at closure, dry covers will be constructed over the tailing storage facility and the mine rock storage facility. This is the last slide. It's a little bit more detail on how water from Jackal Lake will be managed as part of the project. So currently, the stream from Jackal Lake flows this way to the east. Construction will stop that flow, install a pumping station and a pipeline to put the water around, to pump it up above and around the mine area and release it back in the Peterson Creek streambed channel. At closure, that pumping scheme will be taken out and this channel will be reinstituted. So you can see this part of the channel won't go back into the original stream bed because the pit will take it out, but they'll re-engineer the channel around the side of the pit until it rejoins with the existing stream bed.
Now it's your opportunity for any questions that you may have, and please don't be shy. So now it's up to you. Come on up here. If you have a question, don't be shy. It's usually shy for the first person to come up here. But
Gene Walters. I just I just want to know how deep these wells are on these residential properties or commercial properties that you're using for water. Are they shallow wells or deep? Like, are they taking surface water or are they taking water from the aquifer?
That's a good question, Gene, and the answer is yes. There are shallow wells that are installed, and some of them may intercept water that would be running off in creek beds or contributing to it. There are also deep wells installed in some of the areas. I think the deepest I've seen in the records is over 100 meters, but nothing below about 200.
Okay.
So, yeah.
The water aren't they having seepage problems up in Aberdeen? I've heard. I don't live there, but I've heard that there's seepage water that they're having problems with. Has it ever been tested, that water?
The city does monitor
They do?
the area,
Okay.
and we've seen some of the data for that area. Jessica can maybe talk a little bit about
The water quality that we're seeing, we saw in the report provided to us, is very similar to that in the property area. The sulfate is very high, which is extremely similar. So there's very high TDS, total dissolved solids, in the water.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Joe Alcock from in town. Which climate stations did you use for your temperature and precip?
Which climate station? So there's a local station installed at the project area, and I believe the data for the rest of them came from regional stations, 6 to 8 of them in the area. We did look also at the Kamloops Airport station. All of the stations used would be documented in the water balance modeling report, which is in one of the appendixes to the application.
In some places, when you are trying to get water chemistry from old established wells, you run into problems with the original pipe stems being corroded or broken down. Have they looked down the wells to make sure they're in good shape, and have they installed new wells for the chemistry testing?
The residential wells, no. Those are the existing wells. Generally, we took water from wells that are being used regularly, so they're continuously being flushed. You would run into that problem if the well hadn't been used in a really long time, and you could expect some potential corrosion of the materials used. But these wells, we didn't look down, and you don't want to necessarily interfere with somebody's well that's functioning well. But all within the site and all of that water quality, we installed the wells with new materials, PVC. And we used clean sand to pack around, so all of those materials are new and those wells are very new. And we also flushed them. We purge enough water so that the parameters are of fresh water and before we collect the sample.
Yes, my name is Ray Lang, Ray Lang from Kamloops. The existing aquifers, I just wondered I didn't realize there were so many of them, and what kind of depth are we at, and what effect would blasting have on them?
In terms of what are the depths of some of the aquifers?
Yeah.
Peterson Creek gets up to about 80 meters deep. The bedrock extends to quite a depth, but the practical depth that you can get water out of economically is usually limited at about 200 meters. In terms of blasting effects on those aquifers, they would be very minor.
You just confirmed my suspicions. People have asked me that live there in that area, and they said, ask about the aquifers, so, thank
Yeah.
you.
Joe Alcock again. Is there enough groundwater supply through the area that you could pump some and supply it to Peterson Creek if the Peterson Creek was going to go down in flow? Is it the right quality or the right quantity?
The quality I can speak to. What we typically see a little bit deeper in the groundwater isn't necessarily what we see at the more shallow interface, which is flowing into the surface water. You tend to see slightly more concentrated groundwater at depth. So it would, if you did that, you could potentially result in a slight increase in your surface water quality parameters. It would maybe, particularly in the low flow, would raise your concentrations a bit. But in terms of the volume, I mean, it's not something we considered to offset the flow reductions.
I guess I can add a little bit more to that. The Peterson Creek aquifer does discharge into Peterson Creek. So if you were to pump water from that aquifer and deliver it into the creek, you might be robbing Peter to pay Paul. So you need to look at that in fair detail to see if there would be an effect that needs to be considered. We haven't done that at this point.
What effect would the drought conditions have on the flow of Kamloops Lake?
In terms of drought conditions on the flow rate in Kamloops Lake, that's not something that we've considered. We have looked at what the effect of the withdrawal on Kamloops Lake would be during a 10-year low flow period, but we haven't specifically got into analyzing what drought does to Kamloops Lake.
Okay, thank you.
So, again, a big hand for our two presenters here this afternoon. We appreciate it. And again, if you require more input, you have input in the foyer and information booths out here as well. And these people are always around as well. After the fact, if you'd like to have a few minutes as well.